The divorce papers were supposed to arrive next Tuesday. Instead, I found my wife's sister living in our guest room with her 3 kids and a boyfriend I'd never met, eating cereal from my good bowls, while her youngest drew crayon masterpieces on my dining room table. "Morning, Martin," Julia said without looking up from her phone. My wife of 8 years sat at our kitchen island, perfectly put together as always. Her blonde hair swept into that effortless bun that probably took 20 minutes to achieve. Diane needed a place to stay for a while. I stared at the chaos that had invaded my orderly suburban home. Diane, Julia's younger sister, lounged in my leather recliner wearing pajamas at 10 in the morning, while some guy with neck tattoos made himself a sandwich from our refrigerator. The kids, ages ranging from maybe 4 to 10, had apparently declared war on our hardwood floors, which were now littered with toys, juice boxes, and what looked suspiciously like goldfish crackers ground into the grain. "Define a while," I said, setting my coffee mug down harder than necessary. "Don't be dramatic, Marty." Julia finally looked up, those green eyes that had once made me forget my own name, now cold as winter glass. "It's just until Diane gets back on her feet." "Back on her feet from what exactly?" Diane snorted from the living room. "My ex was a controlling asshole, just like—" She caught herself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Just like what, Diane?" I kept my voice level, but my hands were clenched. "Nothing," Julia said quickly. "She didn't mean anything." But I knew exactly what Diane meant. I'd heard the whispered conversations, seen the eye rolls when I asked reasonable questions like, "Who's going to pay for groceries for 5 extra people?" or "How long is this temporary arrangement going to last?" The neck tattoo guy, who I learned was named Kyle, wandered into the kitchen and opened my refrigerator like he owned it. "You got any more of that fancy beer, Julie?" Julie. Nobody called my wife Julie except her family, and even then, only when they wanted something. "Check the garage fridge," Julia said, and I watched this stranger waltz through my house toward my beer. "We need to talk," I told Julia. "Later. I'm late for work." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Oh, and Kyle's going to help you fix that loose board on the deck. He's really handy." The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone with my new house guests and the growing realization that my marriage had become a joke I wasn't in on. I'm Martin Greaves, 39 years old, technical writer for a software company downtown. I fix computers, write user manuals, and solve problems for a living. I'm good at finding logical solutions to complex issues. But standing in my kitchen, watching Kyle drink my imported beer while Diane's kids used my couch as a trampoline, I realized I was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with flowcharts and troubleshooting guides. My phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor Frank Callahan, the retired cop who'd moved in next door 6 months ago. "Everything okay over there? Saw some interesting activity this morning." I glanced out the window. Frank stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching my house with the kind of professional attention that made me wonder what he'd observed. "New house guests," I texted back. "Ah. Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." Frank had been a Portland police officer for 30 years before retiring. He was the kind of guy who noticed details, like the fact that my wife had been leaving the house at odd hours lately, or that she'd started parking her car around the corner instead of in our driveway. "Daddy Martin!" Diane's youngest, a gap-toothed kid named Tyler, came running into the kitchen. "Kyle says you're going to buy us a pool." "Kyle says a lot of things," I muttered. The kid looked confused, then ran back to the living room shouting, "He said yes." I closed my eyes and counted to 10. When I opened them, Kyle was back, beer in hand, grinning at me like we were old buddies. "So, about that deck," he said. "I was thinking we could expand it, maybe add a hot tub. You seem like a guy who can afford it." "Do I now?" "Oh yeah, nice house, fancy car, hot wife." He winked. "You got it made, brother." If only he knew. My hot wife had been treating me like a roommate for months. Our conversations consisted of logistics and passive-aggressive comments about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to my inability to be spontaneous. The fancy car was financed up to its roof, and the nice house came with a mortgage that required both our incomes to manage. But Kyle didn't need to know any of that. "I'll think about it," I said. "Cool. In the meantime, Diane and I were talking about maybe turning that spare room upstairs into something more permanent. You know, for the kids." My blood pressure spiked. Permanent? Well, semi-permanent. Like maybe a year or two while Diane gets her cosmetology license. A year or two. I felt something snap inside my chest. "I need to get to work," I said. "Sure thing, boss. We'll hold down the fort." I grabbed my keys and headed for the garage, stepping over toys and around juice spills. As I backed out of my driveway, I saw Frank still on his porch. He raised his coffee mug in a subtle salute, and something in his expression told me he understood more about my situation than I'd realized. The drive to work gave me time to think. How had I gotten here? 8 years ago, Julia and I had been happy. We'd bought the house on Sycamore Street together, painted the walls, planted the garden, talked about kids of our own someday. Now she barely looked at me, and when she did, it was with the kind of tired disappointment usually reserved for broken appliances. When had I become the enemy in my own home? My office building came into view, and I felt the familiar relief of entering a world where problems had solutions and people said what they meant. My boss, Rick, was already at his desk when I arrived. "You look like hell," he said cheerfully. Rick was one of those perpetually optimistic guys who thought every problem could be solved with enough coffee and positive thinking. "Thanks. Just what every man wants to hear. Trouble in paradise?" I considered telling him about my new house guests, but Rick was the type who'd suggest a family meeting and group therapy. Instead, I just shrugged and headed to my desk. The morning passed in a blur of technical documentation and software testing. Around noon, my phone rang. Julia. "Hi," she said, and I could hear traffic in the background. "I wanted to apologize for this morning. I know this is an adjustment." "An adjustment. That's what we're calling it?" "Diane's been through a lot, Marty. Her ex was abusive. She needs support right now." "What about what I need?" Silence. Then, "What do you need, Martin?" The question caught me off guard. What did I need? I needed my wife to ask my opinion before moving 5 people into our house. I needed to come home to peace instead of chaos. I needed to feel like a partner instead of a paycheck. "I need you to care about my feelings," I said finally. "I do care." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've already decided how this is going to go, and my job is just to pay for it and shut up." Another long silence. "We'll talk tonight," she said, and hung up. But we didn't talk that night. When I got home, Julia was at something called a curriculum planning meeting that apparently required her to stay out until 10 p.m. Diane and Kyle had ordered pizza, on my credit card I discovered, and the kids were still awake, hopped up on sugar, and running wild through the house. "Where's Julia?" I asked Diane. "Work stuff. She said you'd understand." I understood, all right. I understood that my wife was avoiding me, and that her sister was perfectly comfortable making herself at home in my house while I worked to pay for the privilege. That night, lying alone in my king-size bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when my life had become a bad sitcom. Somewhere in the walls, I could hear Kyle's television, tuned to what sounded like an action movie at full volume. One of the kids was crying. Diane was on the phone with someone, her voice carrying through the thin walls as she complained about her situation. My phone buzzed. A text from Frank. "Garage lights on if you need to talk." I looked out my bedroom window. Sure enough, Frank's garage was lit up, the door open, revealing a neat workshop and what looked like a small refrigerator. The man was offering sanctuary, and for the first time all day I felt like someone was on my side. But I didn't go over. Not that night. Instead, I lay there listening to the chaos that had invaded my home and tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, I was ready to burn the house down. Not literally, of course, I'm not a violent man, but the fantasy of watching my mortgage payments go up in smoke had become oddly comforting as I stepped over Kyle's work boots every morning and found my coffee maker clogged with grounds from whatever industrial-strength brew he preferred. "Morning, sunshine," Diane called from the kitchen as I stumbled downstairs. She'd taken to cooking elaborate breakfasts that left every pan dirty and the stovetop looking like a crime scene. "Kyle's already outside working on the deck expansion." The deck expansion I'd never approved. The one that somehow required him to use my tools, my lumber, and my Saturday mornings to supervise what appeared to be a construction project designed by someone who'd learned carpentry from YouTube videos. "Great," I muttered, pouring coffee from a pot that tasted like it had been filtered through gym socks. "You don't sound grateful," Diane said, flipping what looked like pancakes but smelled suspiciously like fish. "Kyle's doing this for free." Free. Right. Except for the materials, the tools, the food, the utilities, and the slowly mounting credit card bills that Kyle seemed to think were community property. Julia breezed through the kitchen, grabbing a piece of toast and kissing my cheek with the mechanical affection of a well-programmed robot. "Don't forget we're having dinner with Tom and Sarah tonight." Tom and Sarah Mitchell, our closest friends for the past 5 years. The couple we'd vacationed with, shared holidays with, trusted with our spare key and our deepest complaints about work, family, and life in general. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I gestured toward the living room, where Tyler was attempting to teach Kyle's pit bull, when had we gotten a dog, to fetch using my reading glasses. "They'll understand," Julia said. "They're our friends." But as I watched Julia grab her purse and head for the door without so much as acknowledging the chaos around us, I wondered if she understood what friendship meant anymore. The Mitchells arrived at 7, bearing wine and the kind of cautious smiles people wear when they're not sure what they're walking into. Tom, a fellow software guy who shared my appreciation for order and logic, took one look at our living room and raised his eyebrows. "Redecorating?" he asked. "Diane's staying with us for a while," Julia explained, as if that covered the presence of Kyle's motorcycle in our driveway and the fact that our dining room table was currently being used as a fort by 3 kids who weren't ours. Sarah, ever the diplomat, smiled brightly. "How nice! Family is so important." Dinner was a disaster. Kyle joined us uninvited, regaling Tom and Sarah with stories of his various business ventures, all of which seemed to involve other people's money and none of which had worked out. Diane complained loudly about her ex-husband, the court system, and the general unfairness of life. The kids treated our formal dining room like a playground, and Julia acted like this was all perfectly normal. "So, Martin," Tom said during a brief lull in the chaos, "how's work going?" "Fine," I said, watching Tyler use his fork to catapult mashed potatoes at his sister. "Same old problems, different day." "Must be nice having a full house," Sarah added, ducking as a dinner roll flew past her head. "It's certainly something," I replied. Kyle laughed. "Marty's still adjusting. He's used to having everything just so, you know? But life's messy, right? Gotta roll with it." The implication was clear. I was uptight, inflexible, unable to handle a little chaos. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, and I saw something shift in their expressions. Suddenly, I wasn't the reasonable guy dealing with an unreasonable situation. I was the stick in the mud who couldn't appreciate his wife's generosity. "Well," Tom said carefully, "it's great that you're helping family." After they left, Julia turned to me with the first genuine smile I'd seen in weeks. "See? That wasn't so bad." "Wasn't so bad?" I stared at her. Sarah got hit in the head with a dinner roll. Kyle told them about his pyramid scheme. Your nephew used my grandmother's china as a frisbee. You're being dramatic. I'm being realistic. No, you're being selfish. Julia's smile vanished. This is temporary, Martin. Diane needs our help. What about what I need? What you need is to stop thinking the world revolves around you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the evening, the way Tom and Sarah had looked at me like I was the problem. These were people who knew me, who'd seen me at my best and worst, who'd always been in my corner. But somehow in the span of one dinner, I'd become the villain in my own story. At 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and wandered to the kitchen for water. The house was finally quiet, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Through the window, I could see light coming from Frank's garage. I found myself walking across the yard in my pajamas and slippers, drawn by the promise of sanity in an increasingly insane world. Frank looked up as I appeared in his garage doorway. "Figured you'd show up eventually," he said. His workshop was immaculate, tools arranged by size and function, workbench clear except for what looked like a small electronics project, everything in its place. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in weeks. "Rough night?" he asked, gesturing to a folding chair beside his workbench. "Rough month." I sat down gratefully. "Sorry to bother you." "No bother. I'm a night owl anyway." Frank set down his soldering iron and leaned against the workbench. "Want to talk about it?" So I told him everything. The sudden invasion, Kyle's presumption, Diane's entitlement, Julia's dismissal of my concerns, the way my friends had looked at me like I was the unreasonable one. Frank listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know what your problem is?" he said finally. "I'm sure you're going to tell me. You're fighting fair." Frank opened his mini fridge and pulled out 2 beers, handing me one. "These people aren't playing by the same rules you are. They're taking advantage of your decency. So, what am I supposed to do? Kick them out? Julia would never forgive me." Would that be such a bad thing? The question hung in the air between us. Would it be bad if Julia didn't forgive me for standing up for myself? When had her forgiveness become contingent on my willingness to be a doormat? "Tell me something," Frank said. "When's the last time your wife asked what you wanted? Not what you thought about her decision, but what you actually wanted." I thought about it. Really thought about it. "I can't remember." "And your friends tonight? Did they ask for your side of the story?" They just assumed I was being difficult." Frank nodded. "That's what I thought. You know what I learned in 30 years of police work? People will treat you exactly as badly as you let them. And right now, you're letting them treat you like garbage. So what do I do?" Frank smiled, and there was something almost predatory in his expression. "You stop playing defense and start playing offense. You stop being the nice guy who gets walked on and start being the guy who fights back." "I don't know how to do that." "Lucky for you, I do." Frank raised his beer in a toast. "Welcome to the war room, Martin. Time to take your life back." Over the next hour, Frank laid out what he called basic reconnaissance. He taught me how to document everything: dates, times, expenses, conversations. He showed me how to use my phone's voice recorder app, how to take photos that would hold up as evidence, how to keep records that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "The key," he said, "is information. Right now, they're operating under the assumption that you're going to keep being the nice guy who pays for everything and doesn't complain. But knowledge is power, and power is what you're going to need to change this situation." When I finally went back to the house, I felt different. Not angry exactly, but focused, determined. For the first time in weeks, I had a plan. The next morning, I started paying attention, really paying attention. I noticed that Kyle wasn't actually working on the deck expansion. He was dismantling it and selling the materials. I saw Diane going through our mail, opening bills and credit card statements. I overheard Julia on the phone telling someone that I was being difficult about the family situation, but that she had it under control. Most importantly, I started recording everything. By the end of the week, I had a file folder full of evidence and a growing understanding of just how badly I'd been played. But I also had something else, a plan for revenge that would make them all regret the day they decided to take advantage of Martin Greaves. The war had begun. 2 months after my midnight conversation with Frank, I was ready to deploy what we'd codenamed Operation Cleanup. The evidence file had grown thick with documentation, photographs, and recordings that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse of my hospitality, finances, and trust. But first, I had to deal with Tom and Sarah. They'd invited us to their annual barbecue, a tradition that usually marked the beginning of summer and included our entire social circle. Julia had accepted immediately, probably seeing it as another opportunity to normalize our temporary living situation, which had now stretched into its 3rd month with no end in sight. "You need to be on your best behavior," Julia warned me as we got ready. "Tom mentioned that people are starting to talk." "Talk about what?" "About how you're handling the situation with Diane. Sarah said you seemed really tense at dinner." Of course, I was the problem. Not the fact that Kyle had sold my lawnmower without asking, or that Diane had run up $300 on my credit card buying necessities for the kids, or that our house now looked like a cross between a daycare center and a frat house. "I'll try to contain my tension," I said. The barbecue was held in the Mitchells' pristine backyard, complete with professional landscaping and a deck that actually looked like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. Our entire social group was there, 12 people who'd been our friends for years, who'd celebrated our anniversaries and commiserated over our struggles. Julia worked the crowd like a politician, charming everyone with stories about how wonderful it was to help family, how rewarding it felt to open our home to people in need. She painted herself as a saint, and by implication, made me look like a selfish bastard for having any concerns about the arrangement. "Martin's been such a good sport about everything," she told Lisa and Mike, another couple from our circle. "It's not easy adjusting to a full house, but he's learning to be more flexible." Learning to be more flexible. Like I was a child who needed to be trained. "It must be challenging," Lisa said sympathetically, but she was looking at Julia, not me. "Oh, it is. But family is family, you know. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices." I excused myself and went to find Tom, who was manning the grill with the focused intensity of a man who took his barbecue seriously. "How's it going, buddy?" he asked without looking up from the burgers. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure." He flipped a burger and glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Look, if this is about the other night, Sarah feels bad about what happened. She didn't mean to make things awkward." "What do you mean?" Tom looked uncomfortable. "She called Julia the next day to apologize. She said she might have seemed judgmental about your situation." "My situation. Not our situation. Mine." "What exactly did Julia tell her?" "Just that you were having trouble adjusting to the changes, and that it was causing some stress in your marriage." Tom finally looked at me directly. "She's worried about you, man. We all are." "Worried about me?" "Yeah. Julia said you've been acting kind of paranoid lately. Keeping track of expenses, recording conversations, spending a lot of time with that weird neighbor of yours." The world tilted slightly. Julia knew about my documentation project. She'd been monitoring my activities and reporting back to our friends, painting me as unstable, paranoid, unable to handle a simple family situation. She said that? Look, I get it. Having house guests can be stressful, especially when it goes on longer than expected. But these are family members who need help. Maybe you could try to see it from Julia's perspective. I stared at my oldest friend, this man who'd been my best man, who'd helped me move into the house on Sycamore Street, who'd listened to me complain about work and marriage and life for 5 years. And he was looking at me like I was the problem. "You think I'm being unreasonable," I said. "I think you're under a lot of stress, and maybe that's affecting your judgment." There it was. My judgment was compromised. I was the unstable one. Julia had successfully reframed the entire situation, turning herself into the long-suffering wife dealing with a difficult husband who couldn't handle a little chaos. "Excuse me," I said, and walked away. I found Sarah in the kitchen, arranging appetizers with the kind of precision that reminded me why we'd always gotten along. She looked up when I entered, and I saw something in her expression that might have been pity. "Martin, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be fine?" "Well, Julia mentioned that things have been a little tense lately. She's concerned about you." "Is she now?" Sarah set down her serving spoon and looked at me with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for sick relatives. "She said you've been acting suspicious, keeping records of everything, making accusations. That doesn't sound like you." "What if I told you that Diane's boyfriend sold my lawnmower without asking? What if I told you that they've run up over $1,000 in charges on my credit cards? What if I told you that they've been living in my house for 3 months with no intention of leaving, and that Julia knew this from the beginning?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "I'd say that sounds like the kind of thing you should work out in counseling." Counseling. Of course. Because the problem wasn't that I was being taken advantage of. The problem was that I wasn't handling it well. "You don't believe me." "I believe you're upset. But Martin, these are serious accusations, and Julia's really worried about your mental state." "My mental state." I looked around the kitchen, at the perfect granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, at the life Tom and Sarah had built together, based on mutual respect and shared decision-making. Then I thought about my own kitchen, currently occupied by people who saw me as nothing more than a paycheck with legs. "You're right," I said finally. "I should probably talk to someone about this." Sarah smiled with relief. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Julia will be so happy." But I wasn't planning to talk to a counselor. I was planning to talk to Frank. That night, after Julia had finished telling me how proud she was that I'd handled myself well at the barbecue, I slipped out to the garage next door. Frank was waiting for me, 2 beers already open on his workbench. "How'd it go?" he asked. "They think I'm crazy." "Of course they do. She's been working on that narrative for weeks." Frank handed me a beer. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I told him about the conversations, the way our friends had looked at me, the careful way they'd spoken like I might snap at any moment. "She's isolating you," Frank said when I finished. "Classic manipulation tactic. Make you look unstable, turn your support system against you, then position herself as the reasonable one who's trying to help." "So what do I do?" Frank smiled that predatory smile again. "You give them exactly what they expect. You act crazy, but you do it smart." Over the next hour, Frank laid out a plan that was so simple, so elegant, that I wondered why I hadn't thought of it myself. If Julia wanted to paint me as unstable, I'd be unstable. If she wanted to tell people I was paranoid, I'd be paranoid. But I'd do it in a way that would expose the truth and force everyone to see what had really been happening. "The beauty of this plan," Frank explained, "is that it uses their own assumptions against them. They think you're losing it? Fine, let them think that. But make sure that when you finally snap, it's in a way that reveals exactly what they've been doing to you. And if it backfires, it won't. Trust me, I've seen this play out before. People like your wife and her sister always overplay their hand. They get cocky, make mistakes. All you have to do is give them enough rope to hang themselves." 2 weeks later, I was ready to spring the trap. It started with the barbecue. I'd been planning it for days, sending out invitations to everyone we knew, Tom and Sarah, Lisa and Mike, our neighbors, Julia's co-workers, even some people from my office. A big, elaborate 4th of July celebration in our backyard, complete with catered food and professional decorations. Julia was suspicious from the start. "Why are you suddenly interested in entertaining?" "I've been thinking about what everyone said, about being more flexible, more accepting of our situation. I want to show everyone how well we're all getting along." She didn't buy it, but she couldn't object without seeming ungrateful for my newfound attitude. The day of the party, our house was packed with people. Julia played the perfect hostess, introducing Diane and Kyle as her beloved family members, who were temporarily staying with us during a difficult transition. I played the perfect host, making sure everyone had drinks, asking about their families, acting like the reasonable, stable guy everyone thought I should be. And then, right as the sun was setting and everyone was gathered on the deck admiring Kyle's construction work, I made my move. "I'd like to make a toast," I announced, raising my beer bottle. Everyone gathered around, smiling and expectant. "To family," I began, "and the sacrifices we make for the people we love." Murmurs of agreement, raised glasses. 3 months ago, my wife's sister needed help. She'd left an abusive relationship and had nowhere to go. Of course, we said yes. Family is family, right? More nods, more smiles. Julia looked pleased. Since then, we've learned so much about sacrifice, about flexibility, about what it really means to open your home to people in need. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. For instance, we learned that temporary can mean anything you want it to mean, like this conversation I recorded last week. I hit play. Diane's voice filled the evening air, crystal clear. "Why would we leave? This is the best setup we've ever had. Martin pays for everything, and Julia's too scared of looking bad to kick us out. We could stay here for years." The silence that followed was deafening. "Or this one," I continued, playing another recording. Kyle's voice this time. "The guy's a total pushover. I sold his lawnmower, his tools, even some of his furniture. He hasn't said a word. Julia's got him completely whipped." I looked around at the crowd of shocked faces. Tom and Sarah looked like they'd been slapped. Lisa had her hand over her mouth. "But wait, there's more." I pulled out a folder thick with documents. Credit card statements showing over $3,000 in unauthorized charges. Photos of Kyle dismantling my deck and selling the materials. A recording of Julia telling her mother that I'm too weak to do anything about it. Julia's face had gone white. "Martin, stop." "Stop what? I'm just sharing with our friends. Isn't that what you wanted? For everyone to understand our situation?" I turned back to the crowd. "You see, for months, everyone's been worried about my mental state. My wife told you I was being paranoid, unreasonable, unable to handle a simple family situation. And you believed her because why wouldn't you? She's so reasonable, so caring, so generous with other people's money." "That's enough," Julia said, but her voice was shaking. "No, it's not nearly enough." I pulled out my phone again. This is my favorite recording. Julia talking to her sister about their long-term plans. Julia's voice filled the air. "He'll never leave me. He's too pathetic. We can keep this going as long as we want. He'll complain, but he'll keep paying. That's what he's good for." The silence stretched on forever. I looked around at our friends, our neighbors, people who'd known us for years. The pity in their eyes had been replaced by something else. Understanding, anger, disgust, but not directed at me. "So yes," I continued, "I've been acting paranoid. I've been keeping records, recording conversations, documenting everything, because I knew that if I didn't, no one would believe me. You'd all keep thinking I was the problem." I turned to Tom and Sarah. "You told me to see things from Julia's perspective. Well, here's her perspective. I'm a meal ticket, a pushover who'll pay for anything and never fight back." Tom looked sick. "Martin, we had no idea." "Of course you didn't, because you believed her instead of asking questions. You took her word that I was being unreasonable instead of wondering why a reasonable man might be upset about this situation." I looked at Julia, who was standing frozen beside the grill, her perfect facade finally cracked. "Pack your bags," I said quietly. "All of you, tonight." "You can't kick us out," Diane sputtered. "We have rights." "Actually, you don't." I pulled out one more document. "Eviction notice filed this morning. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Kyle stepped forward, and for a moment I thought he might try to intimidate me. But Frank appeared beside me, his retired cop instincts still sharp. "Problem here?" Frank asked mildly. Kyle looked at Frank's steady gaze and stepped back. "No problem," he muttered. The party broke up quickly after that. People made awkward excuses and headed for their cars, but not before several of them stopped to apologize, to tell me they wished they'd known, to ask if there was anything they could do to help. Tom was the last to leave. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "We should have listened to you." "Yes, you should have." "Are you going to be okay?" I looked back at my house, where Julia was screaming at Diane while Kyle loaded their belongings into his truck. "I'm going to be fine." And for the first time in months, I meant it. By midnight, they were gone. All of them. The house was mine again, quiet and clean and peaceful. Julia tried to come back the next morning, but I'd already changed the locks. She stood on the porch, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. "This is my house too," she shouted. "Actually, it's not," I called through the door. "Check the deed. It's in my name only. Wedding gift from my parents, remember?" The pounding stopped. "You can't do this to me. Watch me." I heard her car door slam, the engine start, the squeal of tires as she drove away. Frank appeared at my side window, grinning. "How does it feel? Like I can breathe again?" "Good, because this is just the beginning. Now comes the fun part." He was right. Over the next few weeks, I systematically dismantled the life Julia had built on my foundation. I canceled the credit cards she'd been using. I removed her from my bank accounts. I filed for divorce, citing abandonment and financial abuse, with a folder full of evidence to support my claims. Most satisfying of all, I sent copies of the recordings to everyone we knew. Not out of spite, but out of a desire for the truth to be known. I wanted people to understand what had really happened, how I'd been manipulated and gaslit and dismissed. The response was overwhelming. Friends who'd been avoiding me called to apologize. Neighbors stopped by to check on me. Even my boss, Rick, pulled me aside at work to tell me how impressed he was with how I'd handled the situation. "Takes guts to stand up for yourself like that," he said. "Lot of guys would have just kept taking it." Maybe. But I wasn't most guys. Not anymore. 6 months later, the divorce was final. Julia got nothing. The prenup I'd insisted on, despite her protests, had protected everything I'd earned before and during our marriage. She'd moved in with Diane, who was apparently still looking for that cosmetology license. Kyle was in jail for selling stolen property. Turns out my lawnmower wasn't the only thing he'd been fencing. And me? I was sitting on my deck, the one I'd rebuilt myself, properly this time, drinking a beer and watching the sunset. Frank wandered over with his own beer. "Any regrets?" "Only one," I said. "I should have done it sooner." Live and learn. Live and learn. We sat in comfortable silence, two men who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing by rules that were designed to make you lose. My phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Barbecue at our place this weekend. Just the old crowd. You in?" I looked at my peaceful house, my quiet street, my life that was finally my own again. "Yeah," I texted back. "I'm in."